So you're thinking about buying a home in the United States. That's adorable. Back in the day, you could sling newspapers as a teenager and walk away with a 3-bedroom ranch-style house and have enough left over for a Chrysler Cordoba with Corinthian leather.
The Chrysler tradition of luxury. Yes, even rich Corinthian leather.
But in 2025, you need a salary that sounds like you're running a hedge fund, even if all you want is a decent house with functioning plumbing. Today we're looking at what kind of money you need to make every year to afford the average home in America, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. We're taking a look at every state. How did we do this? We crunched numbers on monthly mortgage payments in every state. And here's how we got our results. We used the median home price listing from January 2025, figured in the 6.91% interest rate for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, and we added in some estimates on property taxes and insurance. Of course, we are assuming that the buyer put down 10% and aimed to keep their mortgage payments under 30% of their gross monthly income. You all ask how I figure this out all the time. There you have it. So today we're looking at what kind of money you need to make in each state to buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Number 1, Alabama. Sweet home Alabama. Sure, if you've got nearly 6 figures laying around. The good news is that it's one of the cheapest states on the list. The bad news is you still got to make $94,000 a year. That could be you alone or a couple, whatever. We're not figuring in kids or any medical issues you have or anything like that. Your student loans, nothing. This is just basics. Number 2, Alaska. Want to freeze and go broke? Welcome to Alaska. Stunning scenery, yes. Affordable housing? Not unless you're fishing for king crab professionally. Alaska's got a lot of problems when it comes to how much things cost. Housing is just one of them. If you want to buy a house in Alaska, you're going to need to have $122,211 a year. Number 3, Arizona. Arizona used to be a retirement haven. Now it's more like a desert mirage where homes exist, but only for those with very real, very large paychecks. Arizona's biggest problem is they got popular, which means when you get popular, you start building more expensive homes. More things show up and the quality of life goes up with it. This happens everywhere. Once things get better in a place, it gets more expensive. If you want to live someplace where everything stays affordable forever, start looking for places like Pig Nipple, Mississippi. If you want to buy a home in Arizona and live comfortably, you're going to need to make about $140,000 a year. Number 4, Arkansas. Arkansas keeps it relatively humble. You can still get a place for under $90,000 worth of income. Just be prepared for humidity and the occasional armadillo sighting. Arkansas, by the way, only has one species of armadillo. It's the 9-banded diller or dilla or armadillo, whatever you want to call it. Arkansas is definitely affordable. You can't really argue with that. And the disclaimer I always have to give for Arkansas, the northwest corner is not really Arkansas, even though it's within the state's borders. It is a little more expensive up there, but still cheaper than most states. If you want to buy a house in Arkansas, you got to have about $85,695 a year to live comfortably. Number 5, California. No, really, that's not a typo. I'm actually going to tell you how much you need to buy a house in California, and it will be shocking. Welcome to California, where gasoline, diamonds, and despair cost the same thing. If you want to buy a house in California, you'll need to make about $210,000 a year. Number 6, Colorado. The Rockies are beautiful, but you'll need a rock-solid income to afford a house here. Blame techies and ski lodges, not just Californians. If you want to buy a home in Colorado, the average income you're going to need is about $166,000. Number 7, Connecticut. Connecticut, where colonial charm meets brutal mortgage calculators. You'll need more than charm to live here. Even in Hartford, where that place sucks, it's still expensive. And if you want to buy a home in this state, you're going to need to make about $146,000 a year. That's in 2025. If you come at me in 2035 after watching this video, I'm going to have to stop and show you how to check the date on a video. If you want to buy a house in Connecticut, you're going to need to make about $146,000 a year. Number 8, Delaware. Tiny state, big paychecks. Delaware prices might surprise you. Apparently, people want to be really close to tax shelters and beaches. If you want to buy a home in Delaware, you need to make about $141,000 a year. Number 9, Florida. Between hurricanes, sinkholes, and gators, you'd think Florida would be a bargain. Nope, you still gotta have 6 figures. If you want to buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in Florida, you're gonna need about $127,000 annually. Number 10, Georgia. Georgia's peachy until you try and buy a home near Atlanta. Then it's less sweet and more hold my wallet. See the prices here and you clutch your wallet like you're clutching your heart during a heart attack. My cousin did that once. Whipped his hand around to his back pocket, cover his wallet. He looked like he was having a heart attack in his butt. If you want to buy a house in Georgia, you're going to need to make about $113,000 a year. 11, Hawaii. Ah, yes, paradise comes with a price tag. If you dream of Mai Tais and ocean views, just know that you'll need nearly $250,000 salary to buy a house here. You need about $235,000 a year to buy a home in Hawaii. Number 12, Idaho. Potatoes and price hikes. Idaho's popularity has spiked, and so has the housing market. Boise isn't Boise cheap anymore. If you want to buy a house in Idaho, you're going to need about $164,000 a year. Now keep one thing in mind, everyone. This is the state average. Sure, if you just focus on one city, you'll need more money than I'm telling you right here. This is just the average for the entire state. Number 13, Illinois. Get a little cheaper here. One of the few big states where your house won't eat your whole salary. Maybe just don't set up shop too close to Chicago unless your wallet is ready. Chicago is painfully expensive, but the smaller towns are not. You want to buy a house in Illinois? You're going to need an average salary of about $86,000 a year. That's not bad. Add a 1 on the front of that if you want to buy in Chicago. 14, Indiana. Solidly Midwest and solidly affordable. Hoosiers' homes are still within reach for many people. If you want to buy a house in Indiana, you're going to need to make about $82,000 a year. 15, Iowa. Iowa stays true to its roots. Low-key, corn-fed, and surprisingly affordable. You know, I think it's just a matter of time before Iowa becomes one of the move-to states. They got a lot of open land that isn't horrible. You know, we're not talking the New Mexico outback. It's decent land, it's affordable, and good people. But if you want to buy a house here, you're going to be needing to make about $82,000 a year. 16, Kansas. There's no place like home, especially if you can actually afford one. Kansas keeps things grounded and affordable. If you want to buy a house in Kansas, your salary needs to be somewhere around $83,000 a year. 17, Kentucky. The bourbon is cheap and so are the houses, relatively speaking. One of the more affordable states for home ownership. The bluegrass state, where you only need to be making about $88,000 a year to afford a house here. 18, Louisiana. Cajun country keeps things cost effective. Actually, if you ever spend any time in Louisiana, especially around New Orleans or Baton Rouge, you'll wonder why anyone is actually purchasing homes here. If you can handle the weather and the risk of flooding, your wallet might survive. If you want to buy a house in Louisiana, you need to be making about $80,000 a year. 19, Maine. Maine's natural beauty is undeniable, but housing costs have crept up. Maybe it's all those people fleeing to Massachusetts. If you want to buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Maine, you'll need to make about $129,000 a year. Number 20, Maryland. Close to DC, which means prices are close to unholy. Maryland makes you pay for those Potomac views. If you want to buy a home in Maryland, keep in mind the entire state is not Baltimore, but you're going to need to have a salary of about $117,000 a year. 21, Massachusetts. If you ever want to pay Ivy League tuition but live in a 2-bedroom bungalow, Massachusetts has got you covered. If you want to buy a home in Massachusetts, buckle up for this one. You're going to need to make about $215,000 a year or have a big trust fund from your parents. 22, Michigan. Detroit may still be recovering, but for now, Michigan offers one of the lowest required incomes. Cold? Yes. Broke? Not necessarily. But if you want to buy a home here, you're going to need to make about $79,000 a year. 23, Minnesota. What a difference a couple states over makes. Minnesota's still affordable, but compared to Michigan, they're expensive. Minnesota is nice until you check the weather and the mortgage rates. Then you realize getting a house with some property that has a pond on it while making $60,000 a year is not really gonna happen. But it's still cheaper than most coastal states. If you want to buy a home in Minnesota, you're gonna need to make about $110,000 a year. 24, Mississippi. Mississippi stays on brand. Simple, slow, and still fairly affordable. You could buy a house here and still have cash for catfish. If you want to buy a home in Mississippi, you're going to need to make about $85,000 a year. 25, Missouri. If you want middle-of-the-road living and prices, Missouri's got your back. Kansas City ribs are included. If you want to buy a home in Missouri, you'll need to make about $85,000 a year. 26, Montana. Big skies, big bills. Montana's become a haven for the wealthy, escaping big cities. Too bad the prices came with them. If you want to buy a home in Montana, you're going to need to make about $178,000 a year. Now, one little caveat to this, most property in Montana comes with some acreage. 27, Nebraska. Right on the edge of affordability, cornfields, and community. If your salary is close to six figures, you could pull off a house here. You need to make about $99,000 a year to buy a home comfortably in Nebraska. 28, Nevada. Vegas isn't the only thing that'll take your money in Nevada. Try buying a house without rolling dice on your finances. If you want to buy a home in Nevada, you're going to need to make about $142,000 a year. 29, New Hampshire. Live free or die, trying to afford a home. New Hampshire's prices are creeping dangerously into luxury territory. If you want to buy a home here, you're going to need to make about $165,000 a year. 30, New Jersey. The Garden State demands a golden-plated check, high taxes, high home prices, and you're not even in New York City. If you want to buy a home in New Jersey, you're going to need to make about $159,000 a year. 31, New Mexico. It's still possible to live here without winning the lottery, but Santa Fe and Albuquerque are heating up, and it's not just the temperature. They're a little higher than I really thought they would be, but they do have some places that are terribly expensive, and I'm sure that drives up their average. If you want to buy a house in New Mexico, you're going to need to make about $114,000 a year. 32, New York. This includes all of New York, not just Manhattan, which is wild because $190,000 doesn't even get you a closet in New York City. But when you take the whole state into account, you only need about $189,000 a year to buy a home in New York. 33, North Carolina. The secret's out. North Carolina is great. And now it's getting pricey thanks to remote workers. This has become a haven for them. And a bunch of YouTubers, like I've said before. It's weird. If you want to buy a home in North Carolina, you need to make about $117,000 a year. 34, North Dakota. The winters may break your spirit, but at least you could afford to hunker down in your own home. If you want to buy a home in North Dakota, the average salary you're going to need is about $103,000 a year. 35, Ohio. Ohio keeps it real and cheap. It's one of the few states where home ownership still feels doable. If you want to buy a home in Ohio, you're going to need a salary of about $74,000 a year. Not bad. 36, Oklahoma. Between tornadoes and oil prices, Oklahoma is a gamble, but at least housing won't bankrupt you. If you want to own a home in Oklahoma, you're going to need to make about $85,000 a year. 37, Oregon. Portland, come for the Dill Pickle Fusion restaurants and stay because you're stuck in a mortgage you can't break. Oregon has gotten expensive over the years, especially around the major cities. When I moved up here 15 years ago, it was considered affordable. Now it's not. If you want to buy a home here, you're going to need to make about $161,000 a year. 38, Pennsylvania. Not bad for a land of cheesesteaks and coal. Rural areas keep things modest while cities, well, do what cities do. If you want to buy a home in Pennsylvania, you only need to make about $87,000 a year. Not bad. 39, Rhode Island. Now this one is bad. It's small but mighty expensive. Rhode Island punches above its weight class in charm and cost. If you want to buy a home here, you got to be making almost $150,000 a year. $147,000 to be exact. 40, South Carolina. Retirees and transplants are driving up prices here, but it's still on the more affordable side of the spectrum. If you want to buy a home in South Carolina, you're going to need to make about $103,000 a year. 41, South Dakota. Prairies and privacy don't come cheap anymore. South Dakota is quietly climbing the cost ladder. 10 years ago, you only needed to make about $84,000 a year to buy a home in South Dakota. Right now, you're going to need to make about $108,000 a year. 42, Tennessee. Nashville is booming and dragging the state's affordability rate down with it. Yeehaw! And fork over your paycheck, Jethro. If you want to buy a house in Tennessee, you're going to need to make about $124,000 a year. 43, Texas. Yes, everyone's poster child of where to move to over the last decade or so. Texas used to be the land of low cost and big stakes. Now it's just big costs. Blame Austin, they're driving up the state's average. But considering it's a very popular state and moved to a lot by a lot of people, it's still, I would say, affordable compared to the other states that are popular. If you want to buy a home in Texas, you're going to need to make about $105,000 a year. 44, Utah. Utah has beautiful mountains and brutal housing markets. Bring your hiking boots and your 401k. You're going to need them both. If you want to own the average 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Utah, you're going to need to make about $173,000 a year, or jointly, whatever. Needs to be $173,000 to live comfortably. 45, Vermont. Maple syrup, mountain views aren't free. Vermont's cozy charms comes at a cost. If you want to buy a home in Vermont, you need to be making about $145,000 a year. 46, Virginia. Virginia's for lovers of paying a lot for a roof over your head. Northern Virginia is the main culprit, thanks to the DC ties. Everyone that makes a bunch of money in Washington, D.C. goes across the river and lives in Northern Virginia. If you want to buy a home in Virginia, you're going to need to make about $121,000 a year. 47, Washington State. It rains, it's gray, and it's really expensive. Seattle isn't playing around when it comes to home prices. They're serious about it. They're seriously expensive. If you want to buy a home in Washington State, you're going to need $176,000 a year. Now, a lot of Eastern Washington really brings their averages down, but the western part where most people live, that's terribly expensive, and you're going to probably need over $200,000 at least to buy a house somewhere on the western side of Washington. 48, West Virginia. Finally, a place where you don't have to hope your OnlyFans account blows up to be able to afford a house here. West Virginia is definitely the most affordable state in the nation when it comes to real estate. When something's terribly cheap, there's reasons for that. They don't have a lot of jobs, their infrastructure sucks, poverty everywhere, and this is the scary thing. They're doing better than they were, let's say, 7-8 years ago. I love West Virginia. I always hate talking bad about them, but they've been in bad shape for so long. I always hope for the best, but if they start getting too much better, the house prices will go up. And that'll probably drive a lot of their longtime residents out of the state. But where are you going to go? Probably into the woods. If you want to buy a home in West Virginia, you're going to need an average salary of about $73,000 a year. 49, Wisconsin. Wisconsin, great cheese, decent beer, and a slightly too expensive housing market for a frozen tundra. Yeah, Wisconsin's cold, Wisconsin is beautiful, and they've got wonderful people. They have one city that really has any horrible crime, and that's Milwaukee, and compared to some of the other cities in this country that have really, really bad crime, Milwaukee's not doing that bad. But for Wisconsin, it's bad. In a way, I think this price is perfectly acceptable for Wisconsin. If you want to buy a house in Wisconsin, you need to make about $107,000 a year. All right, before we get to number 50, if you're thinking about moving to any state in the United States, there is a link for a website called Home and Money in the description area below. They can get you in touch with a real estate agent anywhere in the country. All right, on to number 50. And number 50, Wyoming. It's wild, it's wide open, and now wildly overpriced thanks to outsiders buying up ranch homes and property. For a lot of people, Wyoming might just be a little too boring and a little too desolate, I guess you could say. Their biggest cities are really just average-sized towns in just about any other state. But there is a lot of people that really like that type of thing. So, I mean, it would be more expensive if it had more things. But it's still reasonable when you consider just about any house you buy is coming with at least an acre. If you want to buy a house in Wyoming, the average salary you need to make is about $135,000. So there you have it, the price of buying a home in 2025. It ranges from barely scraping by to you need to be in the top 5% of earners in the country to live here. Maybe it's time to start looking into yurts, tiny homes, or just building a cardboard box behind a Costco. Because for many Americans, the dream of homeownership is starting to look more and more like a fantasy.